Emma Brooks stood outside the tall glass building with her hands trembling ever so slightly. She looked up at the name Carter Enterprises etched in silver above the entrance. Her reflection in the glass showed tired eyes, lips pressed into a nervous line, and hair tied back in a neat ponytail. Her shoes were worn, her coat second-hand, but she had come prepared. Today was her last hope. If this interview didn't go well, she wouldn't be able to pay the rent next week, and she had already borrowed enough to last this long. Her younger brother, Liam, was sick and needed constant care. She had quietly taken jobs late at night to make ends meet. But none of that mattered right now. She straightened her back, inhaled a shaky breath, and walked in. Inside the elevator, her heart pounded with every rising floor. She had heard stories about the CEO, Daniel Carter. Cold, brilliant, unreachable. He didn't tolerate mistakes. He didn't talk much, and he had fired 3 assistants in the last 2 months. Emma clutched her file tighter and prayed silently that she wouldn't be the 4th. On the top floor, the atmosphere changed. It was quieter, sleek, modern, almost too polished. The secretary, an older woman with kind eyes, gave her a small nod and led her into a large office. And there he was. Daniel Carter sat behind a massive dark desk, dressed in a sharp navy suit. His expression was unreadable. His eyes, a piercing gray, barely looked up as she entered. Emma stood quietly in front of him, trying not to fidget. He finally glanced at her file, then looked at her, his voice calm and clipped. "You don't have much experience." Emma nodded softly and said, "No, sir, but I learn fast. I just need a chance." There was a long silence. He studied her face without emotion. Emma felt small under his gaze, but she didn't flinch. She had come too far to turn back now. Daniel tapped his fingers lightly on the desk, then said, "You'll start today. My schedule is a mess. Don't make it worse." Emma blinked in surprise. That was it. No more questions, no welcome, just a quiet order. But it didn't matter. She had the job. Her new workspace was just outside his office. She sat down, her hands still a little shaky. The day went by in a blur. Files to sort, meetings to schedule, calls to answer. Daniel barely spoke a word all day. When he did, it was brief and emotionless. Emma didn't take it personally. She could tell there was a wall around him, like someone who had locked his heart behind steel doors. But she also noticed small things. The way he paused at a picture on his shelf sometimes. The way his eyes lingered on the city skyline for a moment too long. There was something hidden in his silence. Late that evening, Emma stayed behind to finish sorting documents. She peeked into his office. He was gone. Just as she turned to leave, her eyes caught something odd. One of the picture frames on his shelf had fallen sideways. Carefully, she walked in and fixed it. It was a photo of a woman, middle-aged, warm smile, standing beside a much younger Daniel. His mother, perhaps. The frame was old but well kept. Emma gently wiped off a speck of dust from the glass and placed it straight. She didn't notice that Daniel had quietly walked back into the room. "What are you doing in here?" he asked, voice sharp but not loud. Emma froze, startled. She turned around quickly and said, I'm sorry, sir. The picture was tilted. I just fixed it." Daniel stepped closer, his eyes going from the frame to her face. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a quieter voice, he asked, "Do you know who that is?" Emma shook her head. "No, sir." He looked at the photo for a moment. "My mother, she passed away 5 years ago." Emma's voice softened. "She has kind eyes." Daniel didn't respond. He stood still, the shadows of his past flickering across his face for a second before vanishing again. Then he turned and walked out without another word. Emma left the office that night wondering if she had crossed a line. But something in his eyes had changed when she mentioned kindness. A crack, a flicker. Maybe it meant nothing. Or maybe it meant everything. She didn't know that this small moment, a simple act of care, would be the start of something much deeper than either of them could have expected. She came for a job. He wanted silence. But fate had other plans. The next morning started quietly, just like every other day at Carter Enterprises, but for Daniel Carter something felt off as he walked through the halls of his company, dressed in a crisp suit with his usual calm, cold expression. He passed employees who greeted him politely, but he barely nodded in return and walked straight to his office as always. But when he entered, he noticed the photo frame of his mother was still perfectly upright, perfectly clean, and somehow it made him pause for just a second. His thoughts lingered on the girl from yesterday. The new assistant with tired eyes and careful words. She was different. She didn't ask too many questions. She didn't try to impress anyone. She had simply noticed something out of place and quietly fixed it. Ma arrived right on time with her small bag slung over her shoulder and a notebook pressed against her chest. She walked to her desk without looking around and began checking Daniel's schedule. Her fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, organizing files, setting reminders and preparing notes for his morning meetings. She looked tired as usual, but her focus never wavered. Daniel watched her through the glass wall of his office for a moment longer than usual before shaking his head and going back to his laptop as the day passed. Emma's quiet presence began to create a strange stillness around Daniel's floor. She didn't chatter like the other assistants before her. She didn't make unnecessary noise. She didn't even speak unless spoken to. And yet she noticed everything. She noticed when the coffee machine had been empty and quietly refilled it. She noticed when a junior employee looked stressed and left a sticky note with an encouraging message on his desk, and she noticed when Daniel's voice grew tense on a call and left a cup of warm tea outside his office without saying a word. Daniel was not used to being noticed. Not like this. His world had been built on control and numbers, on power and silence. He had learned to hide his pain after losing his mother, the only person who had ever understood him. After she was gone, he buried himself in work, built an empire, and kept people out, and it worked. Until now, until this girl with second-hand shoes and gentle eyes walked into his office and started rearranging the silence with her small acts of care. One evening the office was nearly empty when Daniel walked out of a meeting and noticed Emma wasn't at her desk. He frowned slightly, then heard a faint sound from the break room. He walked in and saw her sitting on the floor beside a vending machine, her arms wrapped around her knees, her face turned away, but her shoulders trembling slightly with quiet sobs. She hadn't heard him come in, and he stood there unsure for a moment before quietly saying her name. Emma looked up, startled, her eyes red and wet. She stood up quickly, wiping her tears and apologizing. She said she was fine, that she just needed a minute, but Daniel didn't move. He didn't speak right away. He looked at her carefully and asked what was wrong. She hesitated, then gave a broken laugh and said rent was due in 2 days. Her landlord had already warned her once, and her paycheck wouldn't come until next week. She didn't have family to help her, not anymore, and she didn't want charity. Daniel listened silently, something deep in his chest shifting with every word she said. He didn't speak right away, and when he finally did, he said simply, "I can help." Emma shook her head quickly. "I can't accept that, sir. I'm sorry. I'll figure it out." She tried to leave, but Daniel said, "Wait," his voice softer than usual. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering peace. Sometimes people just need a little peace." Emma looked at him, and for a second she saw not the CEO, not the cold man in the glass tower, but someone else, someone who knew what it meant to be alone. She didn't take the money, but she thanked him from the bottom of her heart, and Daniel didn't press again. He just watched her walk back to her desk quietly, and something about the way she carried her pain with dignity made him feel like he was looking at someone braver than anyone he'd ever met. That night Daniel sat in his office long after everyone had left. He looked at the photo of his mother again and remembered how she used to say kindness is never wasted, even when no one sees it, and he thought of Emma and the tea she left on his desk, the smile she gave the cleaning lady, the way she never asked for help but always gave it. He realized he didn't know her at all, not really, but he wanted to. Next morning Emma found a grocery bag at her door. No note, no message, just a quiet gesture. She knew instantly who had left it. She stood there for a moment, her heart full, her eyes wet, but she smiled, a real smile for the first time in days, and whispered, "Thank you," inside Carter Enterprises. Things were beginning to shift. No one knew it yet, but something rare was blooming in silence between two people who never meant to get close. A girl who carried the weight of others with a soft heart, and a man who thought he had nothing left to feel, but somehow fate was already writing something different for them, something unexpected. The days passed and Emma kept working harder than ever, arriving early, staying late, never complaining, not even when her hands trembled from exhaustion or her eyes grew heavy from sleepless nights. She kept smiling, that same soft smile that made people feel safe even when her world was quietly falling apart. She had taken on extra shifts after office hours, cleaning at a nearby cafe to cover her brother's medicine and school needs, and still she showed up to Carter Enterprises every day with her files in order and her eyes calm. Daniel began to notice more than just her kindness. He saw the way her shoulders tensed when someone asked about her life, the way she smiled at everyone else but never really let anyone close," he started, observing her more closely, not out of curiosity, but concern. Something about her reminded him so much of his mother, not just the way she listened or helped others, but how she carried pain like it was just another part of her day, like it wasn't worth burdening someone else with. One afternoon, after a particularly long meeting, Daniel walked out to find Emma asleep at her desk, her arms folded, her head resting gently on her notebook, her breathing soft and slow. At first he started to walk past, but something stopped him. He stood there for a few seconds, watching the way her hair had come loose, the way her lips moved slightly, like she was still repeating her tasks in her sleep. He felt something strange inside, a quiet ache, not of pity but of deep respect, mixed with something warmer, something unfamiliar. She woke with a jolt and sat up straight, immediately apologizing, saying she hadn't meant to rest, but she had barely slept the night before. Daniel told her to take the rest of the day off, his voice gentler than usual, but Emma shook her head and said she needed to finish the week's schedule. She didn't even pause to breathe. She just picked up her pen again and started working like nothing had happened. Evening, as Daniel drove home, he couldn't stop thinking about her. He thought about the quiet strength in her voice, the exhaustion in her eyes, and the fact that she never asked for help, not even when it was obvious she needed it. He remembered when he was young and how his mother used to do the same. She would work long hours, cook meals, care for others, and never say a word about how tired she was, and it broke something inside him to see that same kind of woman suffering. Against 2 days later, Emma fainted in the hallway just as she was handing a file to one of the managers. Daniel had been walking out of his office when he saw her fall. Everything inside him froze for a second before he rushed forward, catching her before her head hit the floor. People gathered, but he shouted for everyone to clear the way, and without waiting, he lifted her in his arms and carried her to his car, ignoring the shocked looks from his staff. The hospital, Daniel stayed by her side, even when the doctor said it was exhaustion and dehydration, and she just needed rest. He sat quietly, holding her hand, watching her sleep, and remembering how he used to sit by his mother's hospital bed years ago, back when he still believed he could save her, back before he knew what it meant to lose someone who gave everything without asking for anything. Back when Emma finally woke up, she looked around confused and weak, and then her eyes met his, and she looked away like she was ashamed of something. But Daniel told her softly that she didn't have to hide anymore. Not from him. She tried to speak, but he placed his hand over hers and told her it was okay. She didn't have to explain anything. Not now, not ever later. He spoke with the nurse and found out about the extra shifts, the lack of proper meals, the unpaid bills, and the younger brother who had been sick for months. Daniel felt a storm rising inside, not just of sadness but guilt and helplessness. He had seen her every day, and somehow missed how much she was suffering. He had been too used to walls, too used to distance, and for the first time he hated the cold armor he had worn all these years. That night, after making sure she was resting safely, Daniel returned to the office and stayed up going through her employee records, her salary, her performance, and everything he could find. Then he made calls, set meetings, and arranged for a quiet fund to be created under the company's wellness support, and placed her name quietly at the top. No one would know, not even her, but she would never have to choose between rent and medicine again. When Emma was discharged 2 days later, she returned to the office, expecting to be scolded or pitied, but instead everything was calm. Same as always, except Daniel looked at her differently, not with sympathy, but with something deeper, something that held both warmth and unspoken promise. He didn't say much, just told her to take things slow, and for the first time Emma felt like she wasn't alone. She still smiled, but now it came softer, more genuine. Not because everything was perfect, but because someone had finally seen her, truly seen her, without asking for anything in return. And even though her world still had cracks, something inside her had started to heal, not because life was easy, but because kindness had finally reached her heart, quietly, gently, and without asking permission. The days that followed were quieter, but not in the same cold way they used to be. There was something different in the air, something warmer, softer, like the sun had finally reached a corner of the building that had always stayed in shadow. Emma returned to work slowly, taking things one step at a time. Her movements were still, careful, but her face held more light than it ever had, and Daniel noticed every change. He noticed the way her laughter returned in small moments when she helped a junior colleague, or the way her hands moved more freely across her desk when she arranged files, like she was no longer carrying every burden alone. Daniel began speaking to her more, not in his usual short commands, but with genuine curiosity, asking her if she needed a break, or if she had eaten, or how her brother was doing it. Wasn't just about work anymore, and Emma saw it. She felt it in the way he looked at her, not with power or distance, but with a quiet kind of care that made her heart both rise and ache, because she had spent so long keeping people out that she didn't know how to let anyone in. One afternoon, it started to rain heavily outside the windows of Carter Enterprises. Thunder rolled gently across the skyline, and the glass trembled with soft wind. The office was nearly empty. Most of the staff had left early, but Emma stayed behind to finish some paperwork. Daniel walked past her desk and paused, his coat already on, and asked if she had an umbrella. She smiled up at him and said no, but it was fine. She liked the rain and would just walk. Carefully, Daniel stared at her for a moment, then without speaking stepped aside and waited as she gathered her things. When they stepped into the elevator together, she looked up at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. But the silence was not awkward, it was full of something unsaid, something growing between them like a flower pushing through cracks in a sidewalk. When they stepped outside, the rain fell softly at first, and then harder. Daniel held his briefcase above her head and walked beside her, both of them half laughing. As the street began to shine with puddles, Emma reached up and took the briefcase from his hand, holding it above both of them. Instead, their shoulders touched, their hands nearly brushed, and for a second time slowed, like the world had paused just for them. When they reached the corner, Daniel stopped and looked at her, the rain tracing lines down his face, and she looked back, and in that moment they both knew something had changed. They didn't speak about it, but their hearts did. The feeling lingered between them all the way home, like a secret too sacred for words. The next day the office felt brighter. Emma hummed softly while sorting schedules. Daniel brought 2 coffees and set one quietly on her desk. Without saying anything, she looked at the cup, then at him, and smiled, a real full smile that made him want to stop time and just watch her forever. Their connection deepened, slowly, quietly, like a book being written in secret. They shared lunch breaks now, talked about music, books, memories of their childhoods. She told him how her mother had died when she was 12, and he shared that he had lost his mother in his 20s and never truly recovered from it. They understood each other in a way that had nothing to do with their titles and everything to do with the scars they both carried. But just as something beautiful was beginning to grow, fate turned its page again, because the past always knows when to return, and it came in the form of Sophia, Daniel's ex-fiancée. Tall, elegant, and cold as glass, she walked into the office one morning unannounced, her heels clicking like thunder against the polished floor. She greeted the staff like they were old friends and asked for Daniel with a smile too sharp to be genuine. Emma stood frozen for a second, then directed her politely to the private office, her heart suddenly unsure, her breath catching in her chest. When Daniel saw Sophia, he stiffened but managed to keep his tone formal. She said she had been thinking about him, that she missed him, that maybe they had ended things too quickly. Daniel listened, but he did not smile. He did not lean forward. His eyes were calm but distant, and when Sophia asked if he was seeing anyone, his silence made her smirk as if she already knew the answer. Outside, Emma tried to focus on her work, but her hands shook slightly as she typed. She heard faint voices through the office door. She imagined them laughing, sharing old memories, and her chest tightened. She told herself she had no right to feel this way. She was just an assistant, a woman trying to survive, but her heart refused to listen. When Sophia walked out, she glanced at Emma with narrowed eyes, as if measuring something, then gave a quiet laugh, and said, "Some things never change, especially men." Emma gave a tight smile and said nothing, but inside, something cracked, something cold and familiar. She had seen this before in her old job, in her life, where people with power chose others like cards on a table. She had promised herself not to feel this way again, not to hope, not to fall, but she already had. That evening Emma stayed late alone in the quiet office. She stared at her resignation letter. She had typed it earlier, not because she was angry, but because she didn't want to be in a place where she didn't belong. She didn't want to pretend her heart wasn't breaking. Quietly and slowly she signed it, sealed it in an envelope, and placed it on Daniel's desk, then turned off the lights and walked away, her footsteps soft, her heart heavier than it had ever been. Daniel arrived early that morning. The city was still, wrapped in a pale silence, the kind that exists just before everything wakes up. He stepped out of his car with his mind already filled with meetings, numbers, deadlines, but none of it stayed in his head for long, because as soon as he entered his Office. Something caught his eye, a plain envelope resting quietly on the edge of his desk, not marked urgent, not labeled, just his name written in Emma's soft handwriting. He stood there for a long second, not moving, not touching the letter, yet his breath caught and a strange weight settled in his chest. He knew something was wrong. Even before he opened it, he could feel it in the air. Something had shifted, something had been left behind. But he didn't want to believe it. Finally he reached for the envelope slowly, as if afraid it might disappear between his fingers. He opened it and unfolded the paper inside, his hands slightly shaking, and as his eyes moved across the page, his world began to slow, each word cutting through him like the wind in winter. Dear Mr. Carter, I want to begin by saying thank you, not just for the job or the support, but for the small moments that meant more than I ever told you. I came here needing work, but I found something more than that. I found kindness when I thought the world had none left, and I found someone who looked at me not as a burden, but as a person. You made me feel seen, and I will never forget that. But I also know where I come from, and I know my place in this world. I don't belong in boardrooms or offices where powerful men have eyes that carry memories of women. I can never compete with. I don't want to stand in the middle of something I was never invited into, and I don't want to be the reason for any misunderstanding between you and your past. So I've decided to leave quietly, without questions, without explanations, because that's what people like me do. We leave before we are asked to. Please don't try to find me, and please don't feel guilty. This is my choice, and maybe someday you will forget me, and that's okay. Toei will remember you as the man who helped me breathe again, if only for a moment. Yours sincerely, Emma. Daniel finished reading and just stood there staring at the letter, his hands still gripping the paper tightly, his chest tight, as if the air around him had been stolen. The words burned into him, each sentence echoing with a sadness that shook something deep inside. He sat down slowly, his elbows on the desk, his fingers tangled in his hair, and for the first time in years he felt helpless, completely and utterly helpless. He had let her go without saying what he truly felt, without telling her that her smile had changed his mornings, that her voice had softened the sharpest edges of his soul. He had waited too long, trapped in hesitation, believing there would always be time, and now she was gone without asking for anything, without even saying goodbye. He thought of the umbrella in the rain, the sound of her laughter over coffee, the way she had quietly straightened his mother's photo, and the way her eyes had looked at him when he first showed her a part of his heart. He had let that woman walk out of his life thinking she didn't matter, when in truth she was the only thing that had ever mattered. Rage began to rise inside him, not towards Emma, but toward himself, toward the silence that had stood between them, toward the past that had chained his heart for so long. He picked up his phone, tried calling her number, but it was disconnected. He sent a message, but it didn't go through. She was gone, truly gone. The day passed in a haze. Meetings, blurred papers stacked, but nothing registered. Daniel kept reading her letter over and over, as if he could change the ending by memorizing the middle, as if her words would suddenly lead to a door that hadn't closed yet. But no door opened, no voice answered. That night, he drove to the place where she once told him her brother was receiving care, but the nurses said she had transferred him to a different clinic and left no forwarding address. He drove to the apartment she once lived in, but it was empty. The landlord said she had moved out quietly, just like she had written and paid the rent in full. Before leaving, Daniel sat in his car outside that building for a long time, staring up at the window that used to light up late at night when she worked extra hours. He leaned his head back, closed his eyes, and let the silence take him, that kind of silence that didn't protect, but punished, because now it was too late to say what he should have said days ago, weeks ago, when he still had the chance. She had walked away from a love he never gave her permission to believe in, and now she would carry only the memory of a man who watched her leave while standing still. And Daniel Carter realized something that night, something more painful than any loss he had ever known. He realized that sometimes the greatest heartbreak isn't when someone leaves, it's when they leave and you never told them to stay. Ava stood at the doorway of Liam's office, holding a folder she didn't care about, and wearing a calmness that didn't match the storm inside her. Every step closer to him made her heart ache, not because she didn't love him, but because love now felt like a punishment she was being forced to endure. Liam looked up from his desk, his eyes meeting hers, and in that moment, something in him softened, as if he could already sense the distance she was hiding behind her smile. He invited her in with a quiet nod, but the space between them felt wider than ever. She handed him the folder and waited while he skimmed through it in silence. The sound of papers turning was the only thing keeping her from breaking. She had spent the entire night rehearsing what she would say, but now the words trembled. Just out of reach, when Liam finally looked up again, he asked if something was bothering her, and that simple question almost shattered her resolve. She sat down across from him, not as his employee, but as the woman who had given her heart to a man she wasn't supposed to fall in love with. Ava took a deep breath and began to tell him everything, not just about her past, but the parts she had hidden out of fear of being judged or pitied. She spoke of the years she had spent caring for her younger brother after their parents died in a car crash, how she worked 2 jobs and slept little just to keep a roof over their heads, how every decision she made since then was about survival, not dreams. Liam listened without interruption, and as her voice cracked, he looked at her not with pity but with a deep, quiet respect. She told him about the shame she carried, how it kept her from believing she could ever be enough for someone like him, how it whispered in her ear that loving him was wrong because he deserved someone without scars, someone without weight to carry. But most of all, she confessed that she was afraid of falling too deeply and being left again, afraid that her presence would only complicate his life, not complete it. For a long moment, Liam said nothing. His silence scared her more than his words ever could, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm but heavy with emotion. He said he wished she had told him sooner, not because he judged her, but because he hated the thought of her carrying all that pain alone. He stood up, walked around the desk, and knelt beside her. His hand found hers, trembling cold in his warmth. He looked into her eyes and said she didn't need to be perfect to be loved. Ava broke into tears, the kind that came from a place buried too deep to touch, the kind that only surfaced when someone saw the part of you that even you tried to forget. Liam held her for a long time, neither of them saying much, because in that silence so much was understood. But when the moment passed, and Ava looked at him again, she saw something in his eyes that made her heart twist. He was scared. Liam confessed that loving her was never the plan, that he had built walls for years around himself. After losing his mother and then being betrayed by his last relationship, he was afraid to feel again, because feeling meant risking loss, and that was something he wasn't sure he could survive a second time. But then she came along and ruined everything in the best way possible. He told her she made him feel human again, that her presence reminded him what it meant to care and to be cared for. But then his words shifted, and the warmth in them turned to hesitation. He told her there were complications, board members who already questioned his leadership, a looming merger that required his complete focus, and most of all, the reality that any personal involvement with an employee could cost them both everything he asked for: time. Not because he doubted her or what they shared, but because he wanted to protect it, not destroy it in the spotlight. Ava nodded, but her heart felt like it was cracking open. Time had always been her enemy. She had spent her whole life waiting for better days, and now she was being asked to wait again, to trust again, to hold on to something invisible and fragile, and still believe it would survive. In the silence that followed, they sat together, unsure of what came next. They were two people pulled together by something stronger than logic, yet threatened by everything reality could throw at them. Later that night, Ava stood on the balcony of her apartment, looking out over the city. The wind brushed her cheeks as if trying to carry away her doubts. She thought about Liam, about his eyes, his honesty, his fear, and his love. And then she thought about herself, about the girl who had walked into that office just needing a job, and the woman who now stood here, heart full of someone she never expected to matter so much. She whispered into the night, "I'm not going to give up," and deep down she hoped he wouldn't either. The morning of her resignation was quiet. Emma stood in front of the mirror for a long time, trying to convince herself that this was the right thing to do. She had packed her small bag, typed the resignation letter 3 times, and finally printed it on paper, her hands slightly trembling as she held it. She was walking away from a job she had once dreamed of, from a man she had come to love deeply, and from a life that had somehow started to feel like home. But she was certain she did not belong in his world. When she reached the office, she didn't expect to see Adam already waiting near her desk. His eyes were tired, like he hadn't slept, and his tie was slightly crooked, which was unlike him. Emma said nothing and handed him the envelope. The weight of silence hung between them. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he looked at her like he was memorizing her face for the last time. She expected him to accept it, to nod, and let her go, but instead he spoke softly, almost breaking. "You think I don't feel this too, Emma? You think I've been cold and distant because I don't care, but I do. I care more than I should, more than I ever expected to, and that's why I've been pushing you away, because I am terrified of what this means." Emma's eyes filled with tears. She wanted to speak, but he continued, his voice trembling slightly. "When you walked into my office that day, you were just another name on a resume, but then you spoke, and something changed. Something woke up in me. I started hearing again. I started feeling again. Every word you spoke pulled me out of the silence I had wrapped myself in." Nima couldn't stop the tears now. They streamed down her cheeks as she whispered, "But I'm just me. I don't fit in your world, Adam. I'm not perfect. I make mistakes. I don't come from money or power. I just needed a job and I just needed silence," he replied, stepping closer. "But fate had other plans. You didn't break the silence, Emma. You filled it with life." She looked at him, his face no longer the cold CEO, but a man stripped of every wall he had built around his heart. He was vulnerable, open, and for the first time truly real. Adam took her hand gently in his. "You once told me kindness heals more than time ever could. You were right. You healed me. You made me feel things I never thought I could feel again. And I know this isn't perfect. I know people will talk, but I don't care anymore." Rima shook her head slowly, still unsure. "But your company, your board, your reputation, let them say what they want," he said firmly. "I'm not losing the one person who made me feel alive again." In that moment, Emma felt the warmth of everything they had shared wash over her. The late nights, the coffee talks, the unspoken care, the gentle moments, and the pain they both carried. It had all led to this one truth: they were meant to find each other. The office slowly began to fill with people, but neither of them moved. Adam pulled her into a gentle embrace, not one of passion, but of deep understanding and emotional truth. It was quiet, but full of meaning, just like their love. Weeks passed and Emma stayed, not just as an employee, but as someone who mattered deeply to him. They did not rush anything. They worked side by side, growing together, learning from each other. Their love was not flashy or loud. It was built on small acts of care, on shared glances and silent strength. The company changed to kindness, became part of the culture the staff felt. The energy shifted. People smiled more, talked more, supported each other more. Because when love leads with kindness, it spreads like sunlight through windows that had long been closed. One day Emma and Adam stood on the rooftop of the building, looking out at the city. They had faced storms but were still standing stronger than ever. She leaned on his shoulder, and he held her hand without words. They did not need grand gestures or loud declarations. Their love was already written in the quiet moments, the healing laughter, and the way their hearts had chosen each other when nothing else made sense. In that rooftop silence, Adam whispered, "Thank you for needing a job, because I didn't know I needed you." Emma smiled through tears of joy and whispered back, "And I didn't know love could feel like this sometimes." Fate doesn't ask permission, it just brings together two broken souls and lets kindness do the rest. The end.